This is QNexus Red from Keith McMillan. It may seem like just a portable MIDI keyboard, but there's much more to it than meets the eye. It has 3 tracks that can be either an arpeggiator, a 32-step monophonic sequencer, or just control up to 3 different instruments over MIDI or using control voltage. It can run pre-programmed sequences, or you can program them in by recording them live like I'm doing now. This new red version has the same guts as the black QNexus that's been around for a while. Both can run the same new firmware. QNexus has 2 octaves of keys which are individually sensitive to pressure, velocity, and back and forth tilt control. It supports polyphonic aftertouch and MPE and has quite a few MIDI and CV options. In this video I'll take a look at what it can do and discuss its pros and cons. Before I start, a quick disclosure: KMI sent QNexus over for review, but as always, they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and store affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. I'll start with an overview of QNexus by way of comparison to Keyboard, a very similar looking product by KMI. There are 3 main differences between the two. QNexus has substantially more connectivity, which I'll go over in a bit, whereas Keyboard can only send MIDI over its micro USB port. Difference number 2 is that QNexus has a built-in 3-track arpeggiator/monophonic sequencer. And difference number 3, QNexus supports polyphonic aftertouch and MPE, whereas pressure and tilt on Keyboard are global. I originally bought this keyboard a few years ago and used it as a travel companion back when Plaits were a thing. Both are sturdy and you can throw them into a bag without worrying about whether they'll get damaged. Both have a 2-octave keyboard with keys or pads that sense velocity, pressure, and tilt individually, but like I mentioned, QNexus can sense and send pressure and tilt polyphonically. Let's take a quick look at this using pigments. So velocity is pretty straightforward. The harder you hit a key, the more velocity will register, and the synth can do whatever it wants with that. Aftertouch is pressure. And like I mentioned, it's polyphonic here, so the pressure on one key can be measured and sent independently of the second key. And then if I go ahead and activate tilt, and let's say send it to CC1, which is the mod wheel, you'll see that the two are somewhat intertwined. So as I apply pressure, aftertouch is registered. And as I tilt my finger backwards and forwards, you'll see the mod wheel control in this case change as well. And you can sort of control both pressure and tilt somewhat independently, but the two are intertwined. This does take a bit of getting used to, finding the sweet spot, especially with tilt. Back to the comparison, both have this pitch bend pad, so that's pretty straightforward. You press the key and can apply pitch bend. The only thing that Keyboard has that QNexus doesn't is the sustain button, which works like a sustain pedal. That button is used as a shift button, and to change presets on QNexus, you do have a pedal input here though. What really sets the two apart though on the firmware side is the new 2.0 update for QNexus with 3-track arpeggiator and sequencer. Old users of the black QNexus can purchase an optional retrofit kit. It comes with stickers because most of the shift functions and labels for 2.0 have changed. By the way, I asked KMI whether they were planning a similar upgrade for Keyboard's firmware, and for now the answer is no. One more difference between Keyboard, the old QNexus, and the new red QNexus, aside from the color, is that the red one is made from a different polymer, which I'm told won't become as sticky as the old ones used to. I had this issue with my keyboard. KMI suggested an isopropyl scrub, which I did. It worked, but my keyboard now has quite a rustic look. Anyway, this isn't supposed to be an issue with the new material. So that's more or less it for the differences. Let's dive in a little bit deeper into QNexus and talk about connectivity. QNexus has 2 USB ports, one on the left, micro USB, and one on the right, a mini USB port. USB both gives it power and can send MIDI back and forth, so you don't need any modular gear or even hardware gear. You can use this just fine with software instruments. Aside from MIDI USB, QNexus Red comes with this adapter, which is mini USB on one side and 5-pin DIN MIDI on the other. This dongle plugs into here and can be used as a MIDI output. You can also buy this optional MIDI expander, which lets you use this as a USB MIDI interface for your computer if you like. Unless you want MIDI in though, you don't really need this. In terms of control voltage, you have two TRS outputs on the left. These are TRS cables that go into modular gear. The first output is a CV and gate pair, and the second output can be configured either as two CV outputs or a CV and gate pair. On the input side, you have a single TRRS jack, which you can use for two inputs, either two CV inputs, as long as they're between 0 and 5 volts. Don't try to feed it anything below 0 or above 5 volts, because this will go a little bit crazy. And you can also plug expression pedals into this with these dongles. All these extra cables are available as an optional kit for purchase. They don't come with QNexus. It only comes with the micro USB to USB cable and this mini USB to MIDI adapter. QNexus, by the way, appears as 3 ports on your computer over USB, one which receives inputs from the pads, another to communicate with the expander if you have it, and another to communicate over CV, both in and out. CV works quite nicely as far as I could test. So right now you're hearing this setup. I'm on track 1, sending out information over this output, CV and gate, going into Rovid, which is a Plaits based module with a few extra controls, then going into ZOIA as an effects machine. Pitch bend works too, by the way. So that's track 1. And then if I go ahead into track 2, I'm controlling Befaco's Lich with another CV gate pair. CV is going directly into Lich, and gate is going into 1UOC to create an envelope going into a VCA, then also into ZOIA for chorus delay and reverb in this patch. There are quite a few CV configuration options, both on the outputs and on the input. Just remember to send only between 0 to 5 volts through here. And in this case, it's configured to move CC 112 and 113. You can send this to any MIDI device, including your computer. Okay, so that's it for the connectivity picture. Let's take a look at the overall workflow. The shift key is the main way that you navigate across the different tracks and track properties labeled above and below the keys. When you hold the shift key, the options you can select are dimly lit. So for example, if I wanted to transpose or change the clock division or change the gate for a sequencer or arpeggiator, you just select it like that. And then once you choose a parameter, say for example, gate, you can edit the parameter values here. So a longer or shorter gate, for example. And then sometimes when you select a parameter, things will light up to hint at additional functionality. So for example, if I choose track over here, you can see that I can choose between track 1, 2, or 3, address the MIDI channel it's broadcasting on, or transpose an individual track as opposed to the global transpose. And then occasionally things will have numerical values, for example, tempo, and that's going to be expressed with a series of blinking pads. You can just use the arrows to move the tempo up and down. The rapidly blinking pad represents the hundreds, the slowly blinking one tens, and then this is ones. So this is 126 BPM or 120 BPM. Looks like this. I didn't mention it so far, but octave transpose works as expected. And then these 4 buttons will either control whether velocity, pressure, and tilt are sent out or not. So a long press will toggle, turn off, basically velocity, tilt, or pressure if you don't want that information to be sent out. And then hold will toggle hold on and off for keys. Obviously that doesn't work for a monophonic synth. The hold also works for the arpeggiator. Then these buttons have a few additional functions. You can use them to choose between one of 4 system presets. You just short press the preset button, then swap to preset B or swap to preset C, go back to preset A. And then since patterns go up to 32 steps, you only see 8 steps at a time for a pattern. You can use these to move between groups of 8 steps. Most of these shift functions I think are pretty straightforward. The ones that maybe aren't are when a long press is required. So let's, for example, run this pattern. So if you hit pattern, you can choose different pattern playback orders. And then a long press on pattern, and that's the less obvious one, will let you load up different patterns. So this is how you swap patterns. You can store up to 8 patterns, by the way. But it works, and a short press loads a pattern, and a long press here will save a pattern if you change it. Again, say shift, stop to stop playback. So that's the workflow and navigation overall. Let's take a closer look at QuNexus. I'll start with the overall track types and settings. Track 1 is the only one that can be used for MPE. In this case, I'm just using it to run a monophonic sequence. And while I've got track 1 going, I can always go into track 2, run a different sequence or arpeggiator there, or just play it. Remember, track 2 is Lich. I could add a third layer as well if I wanted. Let's look at a few more general track settings. These apply both to the sequencer and to the arpeggiator. So for example, if I go into track, I can mute a track with a long press on the track, in which case it'll blink. Or, long press. Bring it back so it takes 3 seconds to mute or not. And then let's go into, let's say track 2. Okay, track 2, and then remember, long press loads a pattern. Let's load maybe this pattern. Okay, so that's that pattern. You can change the gate. Remember I mentioned earlier the short gates or longer gates. Again, it applies both to sequencing and to arpeggiating. You can transpose either all the tracks or individual tracks. So transposing an individual track requires going into that track and then choosing track transpose, and then obviously the two don't match now, and that's how you transpose either individual tracks or all the tracks. So that's track transpose. I can also change the clock division. So let's say go into pattern 2, then choose division, and make that go faster. Or slower. And they got out of sync, but anyway, so that works nicely across the tracks. And swing isn't implemented yet. I think we discussed most of the overall track parameters. Let's dive in and look at the arpeggiator and sequencer individually. So both tracks 1 and 2 were set to sequencer, but I can always go into the track and change it from sequencer to arpeggiator. Let's do that for track 1 as well. So now they're just running as arpeggiators. The arpeggiator has a few interesting tricks up its sleeve. Let's start with the basics. You need to hold it for it to stay held. Okay, pattern order works as you'd expect. So go into pattern, and there are a few up and up down options, and a few order options, and a Brownian mode as well. Anyway, let's stick with up. And that's the basic arpeggiator mode. It does support octaves, by the way. So shift, and this will play it across up to 4 octaves. Anyway, that's the basic arpeggiator mode, and there are 2 other arpeggiator modes. The first will let you add and remove notes freely. Nice way to jam and experiment with melodies. And then the third mode will let you change the pressure and velocity of keys. So hitting any other keys won't do anything. But if you hit these keys while the arpeggiator is playing, then you can change the expression parameters of each note. I haven't configured expression into here, so I'll go into my computer and let's maybe play the arpeggiator using this electric piano plugin. I'll keep it simple. Let's just show this with velocity. So if I can add and remove notes. I'm still in mode 2. Let's move into mode 3, arpeggiator mode 3. In this mode, we can't add or remove notes, but we can change the modulation parameters of each note by tapping it again. This includes velocity, but also tilt and expression. So that's pretty much the arpeggiator. Let's talk about the sequencer. I'm in track 1, and I'm going to go ahead and change it into a sequencer track. You can either step sequence sequences or record them live. Step sequencing is trivial. You hit record when the sequencer isn't playing and just playing notes. So let's say a 4-note pattern. Long press clears a pattern. Hit record again. You can add rests or ties. So for example, if I wanted to rest here, Shift 9 adds a rest. Cool. And yeah, pattern playback impacts patterns as well. Okay, down, up, down. Back to order. Here, you got to remember these by heart or reference the manual. That's how you program sequences step by step. You can also play sequences directly into the sequencer. So this is my pattern. I can change its length, by the way, using the length button. You can go up to 8 on a single page. And remember, I said you've got up to 4 pages, 32 steps per sequence. So you could look at the different pages and then set length to 16 steps in this case. And it'll run through the steps. And then just hit record. And you can overdub any pattern you want. So I've got this. Pretty simple to overdub. And that's pretty much it for the sequencer. Pretty simple and straightforward. You've got 3 tracks, so you can run 3 sequences or a sequence and arpeggiator in parallel. You can store up to 8 patterns per track. There's a certain limitation that you can't store to more than patterns 1 through 4 while a track is playing. And that's the essence of both the sequencer and the arpeggiator on QNexus. Before we wrap up and go to the pros and cons, let's take a look at the control software for this. This is the QNexus editor. You can store a bunch of presets on it and send presets to banks A through D. You can change some of these settings on the keyboard, but it's much easier to do it through here. There are 5 basic tabs. You can customize the keyboard response, pitch bend ranges, what gets sent to Aftertouch, Poly Aftertouch, and to MIDI CCs if you want. The sequencer tab lets you control tempo and clock and where each of the tracks gets sent, as well as a bunch of other parameters I won't cover now. The CV tab obviously handles CV. Like I mentioned earlier, both going out and coming in. The controller tab lets you customize each and every button of the controller if you want to, say, use a button or a pad to send MIDI CCs instead of playing notes. And that's QNexus in a nutshell. Let's talk about some pros and cons. This should always be done in light of the alternatives. I think that the most relevant controllers to compare this to are the 1-track KeyStep 37, the 3-track BeatStep Pro, the 4-track KeyStep Pro, all from Arturia, and maybe the SQ64 from Korg. I've reviewed them all. I'll link to the reviews below if you want the details. But overall, on the pros side, QNexus is super portable. You can throw it in your bag guilt-free without worrying about knobs being torn off. I actually accidentally drop tested this a couple of times. It doesn't weigh much, so you're not likely to feel it. It's very, very portable. It's great as a brainstorming and performance tool, whether you have a smaller modular setup or just hooking it up to a laptop or even an iPad or iPhone. The control software is very usable and helps in creating presets and changing settings that are either hard to reach or unavailable using the controller itself. On the hardware side, while the keyboard is usable, if you're used to regular or even mini keys, those skills aren't directly transferable. This takes time to practice and getting used to. It's just not the same as real keys. In terms of connectivity, this is quite a beast for its size, but if CV connectivity is important to you, most of the other options I mentioned have more. Regarding the shift system, is it too shifty? I'd love to know what you think in the comments below. In my opinion, it's not too bad. Ultimately, the arpeggiator and sequencer are relatively simple, and the shift system gets you pretty far with them with very few hidden shortcuts. On the firmware side, the arpeggiator here is great, and I love its different modes and patterns. The sequencer, though, is only 32 steps. It's monophonic without any motion sequencing. Again, in contrast to most of the other alternatives I mentioned, this is less powerful. Because the sequencer is monophonic, it means you can't easily use it as a drum sequencer, though you can obviously play a different drum every step and use multiple tracks to activate different drums on the same drum machine. Finally, on the firmware side, while I don't do thorough QA tests, over the time that I've had this, I encountered quite a few bugs, all of which were fixed within days or weeks after I reported them. It seems like the QNexus team is pretty adamant about fixing these things, so hopefully in the future, no new ones will crop up. So what's the bottom line? If you've got a shortage of desktop real estate or just want a small setup, or you need a portable multi-track sequencer / arpeggiator to travel with your laptop, QNexus is well worth a look. Personally, for my studio setup, I'll probably stick with a more powerful sequencer, but for travel or vacations, Keyboard has been my travel companion, and you can bet going forward, QNexus will be. That's it for now. If this video was useful, there are plenty more of my insights in my ever-expanding book, available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Don't forget to ring the YouTube bell to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.